Welcome to the Practical Enneagram. Dr. Drew Moser, founder of Type Trail and co-host of Fathoms and Enneagram podcast, is an expert at teaching the Enneagram to companies and organisations. He's also an author, and his latest book is the Enneagram of Discernment. His beautifully written book would work for both Enneagram freshmen and a more seasoned Enneagram practitioner. There are some innovations in Drew's discernment framework, but they are, for me at least, theoretically sound and useful. As the Enneagram is an evolving teaching, we need people like Drew to come along and make distinctions. His words, it took gumption and it was audacious, but for me at least, this can be what's so inspiring about Enneagram 3s. It's just confidence combined with competence. The suggested reflection questions and practices in the book are brilliant and useful for coaches, I believe. This is the Enneagram book that I'll probably give to my niece and nephews when they're old enough. Not because it's not suitable for all ages, but because Drew, being younger himself, is a better and more appealing mentor and voice for people in early adulthood. I hope that you enjoy this conversation, which is about the book and also about Drew's experience writing it. To meet with you, a huge fan of Fathoms and Enneagram podcast. Please say hello to the Seths from me.
I certainly will. If they were here, they would love to say hello back to you.
So I've just read your new book, which I've learned is your fourth book, The Enneagram of Discernment. I absolutely love this book for a variety of reasons. It's beautifully written and edited, extremely well referenced and accessible, and every sentence just lands.
I'm deeply honored. Thank you so much.
Actually, some of the sentences took my breath away. So there was several, but the fours showing up and being present as being a confession of belonging. So beautiful.
Yeah, having you recite that gives me some goosebumps, not because necessarily I wrote it, but because I think one of the best decisions I made about writing a book about discernment, pun intended, was to include people I knew and trusted of that type to read drafts of my chapters. And so I had a small committee of fours who read and gave me feedback. And it was terrifying to do, to be quite honest, to kind of send my half-baked, ideas their way. As a 3, and I'm sure we'll get into this, why that was so hard. But their wisdom and insight into their own experience profoundly shifted the perspective of each chapter in, I think, really incredible and important ways.
I did notice that in the acknowledgements that you consulted a lot in the process of creating the type descriptions.
Once you get into it, it's pretty easy to feel like you're out of your depths. Like, okay, what I didn't want to do and what I was very afraid of doing was writing about each type from a 3's perspective. And because that would be really dishonoring and I would say inappropriate, right? And against what I was trying to do, with the book at all. So having those other voices was really, really important to me.
Yeah, I think the book really benefits from it. So when I asked you to speak with me, it was with the intention of having a conversation about how those of us in the helping profession can use the Enneagram to support spiritual direction and guidance work. My experience since I started coaching is that spiritual concerns are often in the coaching room, declared or undeclared.
Yes.
And because the Enneagram of Discernment addresses these themes exactly, I thought we could talk about the theory in the book. And as you know, I had a few personal curiosities about your process as well.
Yeah.
Before we begin, can you say a little about how you found your way to the Enneagram, how it became central to your work, and what form your work with the Enneagram currently takes in the world?
Yeah, thank you. So I was living and working for a nonprofit in Vancouver, British Columbia, back in 2008 and 2009. The team that I was on, our leader, kind of informed us that we were going to do this staff development exercise in which we would take what I didn't know at the time, but what it was the READY, Enneagram assessment, the Rizzo-Hudson Enneagram type indicator. And then a trained facilitator is going to walk us through the results individually and then as a team. And in all honesty, I went in very skeptical, like this is going to be a waste of time. Another way to kind of label me. I was familiar with other typologies like the Myers-Briggs, DISC, and some of the other ones that were out there, and thought, okay, I kind of have myself figured out. I'm not sure I need any more labels. And so I went in pretty skeptical and came out completely transformed in my approach to the Enneagram. Came out feeling like, man, someone knows me way better than I'm comfortable with. I'm kind of amazed by it and also creeped out by it. And, those phrases you hear others say were really true of me. And I know this is not everyone's experience, but felt like someone had been reading my mail or following me around because the test accurately pegged me as a type 3.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that that's not everyone's typing experience either, right? But it got me quickly and right away. And in the process of learning more about what a type 3 was, I found language to things that I knew to be true about myself, but probably couldn't articulate at the time. It also helped me at least begin to reconcile some of the dissonance I felt internally about myself, some things that I really loved about myself and some things that I just despised about myself. Now, in that moment, that initial staff development exercise, I didn't reconcile fully all of those things, but it did help me give some language in which I can say, okay, these things maybe can coexist and aren't necessarily at war with one another all the time. And that was just really profound for me. And so that led me on this kind of journey of not only understanding more about myself, and understanding what it meant to be a healthy and vibrant type 3, but also how can I use this to help others? Because I've always been in the helping profession in some way, shape, or form, and mostly with younger adults. Not entirely, but mostly with younger adults who are in the throes, of trying to decipher answers to the big questions of life, right? And I found the Enneagram just to be profoundly helpful in raising self-awareness so that those questions could be approached with honesty and integrity, which is really key. And so currently, I use it in a myriad of ways. You mentioned the podcast, Fathoms and Enneagram podcast. We're really trying to do a deeper dive, as the name implies, into some of the Enneagram content that's available in the Enneagram community that's out there. I have a coaching training practice called Type Trail, which does work with nonprofits and corporations and individual clients. And then, I wrote the book. And so I'm steeped in this and really do enjoy it, find it helpful and profound. Yeah.
Thank you. So why discernment? Why did you choose to write about this?
There's a few reasons. First, I deeply believe in the adage that you teach what you need. So I don't approach this subject as any sort of self-proclaimed guru or expert. What I try to do in the book is just say, hey, our personality helps and hinders our ability to discern a good life. And it's just helpful to know those things, right? And also, I think as a 3, I think I have a tendency, as most 3s do, to really struggle with discernment because we can see ourselves doing so many things and succeeding at them, right? Our delusions of grandeur are vast about the things that we can do. And so I think as a 3, I've really struggled to cultivate a sense of discernment that helped me choose the best among many good options, which is often, not always, but often what discernment is really helpful for, that we have many good options. How do we choose, right? So as a 3, I really struggle with that. Moreover, I'm also disappointed in the fact that our information age has not made us any more wise, in my opinion. Like the fact that we have these pocket computers in our smartphones that can give us untold amounts of information doesn't necessarily make us any more wise in the ways that truly matter, right? And so we need to kind of reclaim, I think, the art and practice of discernment in order to live the type of life that we want to, as opposed to just going through the motions of life, letting life, so to speak, happen to us, right? I think discernment calls us to something bigger and better than that.
Love it. You use take a very specific definition of discernment in the book. Can you share it, please?
Yeah. It's a hard thing to kind of pin down a definition of discernment, because I think everyone, if you ask them to define it, they'll struggle or stumble, but they kind of know it when they see it, right? It's one of those concepts. And I think it's because discernment is both a gift and a practice. And I'll get into some of the distinctions there, but I think that's really important to note. I do think it's a gift that we can receive, and it's also a practice that we can cultivate. And so I really offer in the book one very simple definition and then I put a finer point on it with my official definition. And my very simple definition is that discernment is applied identity. And what I mean by that is when we're living from a full and authentic sense of self and engaging our world accordingly, I think we're doing so with discernment. Because a lot of my kind of approach is that our ability to make good and wise decisions has to be rooted in an authentic sense of who we are, right? Now, to put a finer point on it, as I mentioned, I do think that there are some aspects that we can put into a definition that can be really helpful. And so I refer to discernment as living our lives from a deep sense of vocation. And I don't mean that necessarily as equating with a job or career. I mean an overall sense of life calling, right? So we're living our lives from a deep sense of vocation with wisdom in the fullness of time. And the fullness of time is an aspect that I kind of unpack when I get into some of the time orientation aspects. But I do think that those kind of three pillars form a good, at least starting definition of discernment, and actually kind of frame the way of discernment that I unpack in the book over the subsequent chapters, after I give that introduction.
It is such a tricky idea to nail. When I was thinking about it, I suppose prior to reading this book, I would have thought of it as a sort of decision making, an ability to choose well. And it goes back to that Mary Oliver quote that you use throughout the book. It's like, there's a sense of urgency to use the time well.
Right. Yeah, there is. And I think, and this is kind of making a connection to spiritual direction, which you mentioned before, that I think spiritual direction in many ways is helping someone else cultivate the art of discernment, in which many contemplative traditions refer to discernment as the ability to see beneath and through something, right? When we can discern something, it's not just about the point of decision that needs to be made, but it's this ability to have vision to see beneath and through something for what it really is, right? And I think that's so critical, because when we face these proverbial forks in the road, right? Do I go left or do I go right? Do I live here or do I live there? Any of these major decisions, we need to be able to see beneath and through where we are in order to make a good and wise decision, right? In order to make that decision point, as opposed to just jumping ahead to, okay, what's the right decision to make, at this juncture, right? It's a complicated thing, but it's something we all need.
And the central idea being in the book is that the Enneagram can help us to understand our barriers to discernment.
Yeah. Oh, and I think some of our strengths, I think both, right? I think our type helps and hinders us in our kind of discernment journeys in some really important ways. And, this gets at this central tenet of the Enneagram. There's no one type that's better than the other. They're all a mixed bag, right? Of good, bad, and ugly. When we understand that the components of that mixed bag are different for each of the types, I think that has an application towards our ability to make good decisions. That there's some things each of the types do that are uniquely strong and skilled in discernment. And there are also some things that are important hindrances and challenges to understand.
In the book, you identified the major barriers to discernment. Can you describe what they are?
Yeah. So this gets at some of the traditional teaching in the Enneagram regarding the triad, that grouping of three that looks at the 8, 9s, and 1s as the gut types or gut triad. The 2s, 3s, and 4s is the heart types or the heart triad. And then the 5, 6s, and 7s is the head types or the head triad. It has long been taught by many teachers that there is a corresponding kind of primary or dominant emotion that often each type has a unique and enhanced and pronounced experience with it. And it often is triggered or is brought up when anxiety is present. So for those gut types, the 8, 9s, and 1s, they have this unique kind of experience with anger, each in their own way, but anger is a primary or dominant emotion. For us heart types, 2s, 3s, and 4s, we have this unique and pronounced experience with shame as a primary or dominant emotion, which is no fun, but it's there, right? And then 5, 6s, and 7s, those head types have this unique and pronounced relationship with fear, right? And so this is why in some Enneagram contexts, you'll see even the triads referred to by their dominant emotion, the anger types or the shame types, the shame triad, and the fear types, the fear triad. And so what I do in the book is I look at, hey, these are actually barriers to discernment. So I, as a type 3, my experience with shame often serves as a barrier to discernment. In so doing, what we tend to do is when we experience these things, we tend to either avoid them or overdo them, right? Depending on our type, these emotions. So what I do instead of say in the book is say, hey, instead of just settling into the default patterns of our type and how we experience shame, which for instance, a 3 would be to avoid avoid or reframe failure, not learn from our past mistakes, because that's where shame lurks for us, right? Instead, look at these primary emotions as perhaps invitations to deeper growth. And that, this adage that the way out is through, not around. And so I think once we understand our type, we can then become more familiar with our primary or dominant emotion as a way to see and notice, okay, I'm feeling shame. And when I experience shame, I don't make good decisions, right? I tend to shut down. Or I experience fear. And when I'm in a fear state, fight, flight, or freeze is not a good open kind of posture towards making wise decisions. Or when I'm angry, I'm fixated on that point of anger. I'm not seeing the bigger picture, and so on. There's many applications to this.
I really like how this restores, or this focus restores, work on the centers of intelligence to a central place in a growth with the Enneagram process. It often gets missed, doesn't it? The importance of doing this.
Yeah, it does. And I think because our tendency is to not confront, our monsters, so to speak.
Yeah.
No one wants to, or, those that may be more well-versed in like Jungian shadow work, right? These are the things that lurk in the shadows, but if we don't do some good and honest work with them, with our primary emotions, we will continue to trip over ourselves in the same ways, kind of over and over again. Each type has its own experience. Why do I do this same thing over and over again? Right? Why am I like this? And a lot of it's because we have to do some of this work, which is really hard, but really important.
You do something very, again, innovative in the book, which is to establish 3 triads, so perspectives through which to explore what each type tends to miss or neglect when it comes to matters of discernment. Is that accurate, Drew?
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. Yeah.
So the vocation triad, the wisdom triad, the practice triad. Can you say some words about that?
Yeah, I think a central component of discernment is it's far more of a process than it is a destination. And therefore, when we do this kind of discernment work coupled with Enneagram work, then the mantra that I tend to use with my Enneagram work the most is that type is the trailhead. Yeah. So once we discover our type, that is the very beginning of a journey, not the end, right? That doesn't mean that we leave our type. It doesn't mean that we discard it for another, but it means that we can then embark on a really good and healthy, vibrant journey to a better understanding of who we are and, by the way, better understanding others, right? Once we embark, from the trailhead of our type, I think we go through kind of 3 territories of discernment. These triads, I refer to them as triads because each of these territories, I think, has 3 key questions that help us discern our lives better. So you see what I did there? 3 questions, 3 triads, 9 questions, right? It's maybe a bit on the nose, but I think it does help us frame a journey of discernment that is not the definitive list of questions that you have to ask. It's not exhaustive, but I do think these are basic kind of key questions that are helpful to us. Here's the thing about our type is that we tend to focus on only a few of those questions of the 9, right? And so by intentionally focusing on all 9 questions, I think we cultivate more wisdom to discern our lives. And so would you like me to kind of run through?
Yeah, I was about to ask you.
Yeah. So in that first territory of vocation, again, I refer to this as an overall sense of calling, not just your work. Because you are more than your job, right? You have relationships, you have a community, you have all these things that are important to you. There are 3 questions, I think, of vocation. The first is, who am I? This is the question of identity. And this is where understanding our type really helps us begin to see not how our personality fits in the larger sense of who we are, right? So that's the first question. Then the second question is, why am I here? This is the question of purpose. We all kind of face these questions of purpose, like, why am I here? What is my kind of unique and abiding purpose in life that sustains me? And then the third question would be, where am I going? This is the question of direction. And I think once we understand these 3 questions, we're not going to come to definitive answers every time we're faced with an important decision. But I think even reminding ourselves that, hey, whatever decision we make, it needs to be rooted or integrated into a deeper sense of identity, purpose, and direction. That's helpful to us, right?
Agreed.
No matter what our type is, that's helpful. And so this vocation territory really is about our awareness of our type. It really helps identify and observe ourselves in some more nuanced ways.
Very
so
clear.
that's the first territory. The second territory is the wisdom triad.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think once we become more aware of our type, we start to integrate it into ourselves more fully. And this is where I do a lot of work with the stances.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you had any guests on to talk about the stances.
Not yet. No. Who do you suggest for that, Drew?
Well, we can talk about a little bit here and then.
Yes. Let's do it here.
Okay. So the stances are another triadic grouping in the Enneagram. In some circles, they're called social styles or Hornevian groups after the psychologist Karen Horney. And they create a different triangle, when you connect the dots of these three types in their particular stance. There are three stances: the assertive stance, which would be the 3s, the 7s, and the 8s. As their name implies, they tend to be a little bit more assertive in life. There is the dependent, or some would call them the compliant stance, which would be the 1s, the 2s, and the 6s. And then there are the withdrawn types, the withdrawn stance, which would be the 4s, the 5s, and the 9s. And there's a few of these, a few reasons as to why these types are grouped together this way. One would be that they all have a common center of intelligence that they tend to distort or misuse. And then the other, which I'll talk about later, is they all have a similar orientation to time kind of stacking. And so in terms of the wisdom triad, I think there are three questions that help us unpack the ways in which we use our intelligence centers or neglect them by stance. And so those three questions would be, what am I doing? This is really the essential question of the gut center, right, of intelligence, which is really about activity and knowing before you know, right? And just doing things in the world. And then the second question would be, what am I feeling? This would be the question of the heart center. How do we look at our emotions and our feelings as an intelligence center to help us make better decisions? And then the third question would be, what am I thinking? What's going on in my head as I navigate this decision or this issue, right? And each of the stances tends to focus centrally and primarily and probably over-reliantly on one of those questions. And they'll tend to a second one somewhat, and then they'll tend to neglect or misuse the third, right? So is there anything more you want me to say about that, or is that kind of...
That's perfect. That was very clear. This is something you use a lot in your work, Drew, the stances. Yeah,
I do. Because I think it helps us not only see kind of the posture that we take in the world and how that is distinct from the other types and the other stances. And I think it also helps us see this third center of intelligence that we tend to leave out of the equation to our own detriment. Like an example would be, I'll pick on myself again. As a 3, I tend to distort or misuse that feeling center. And so that question, what am I feeling, is not a natural question for me to include when making an important decision or when trying to cultivate discernment, because 3s most of the time look at feelings as a drag on our efficiency, as messy, as things that kind of confuse us and not bring clarity. When in fact, that emotional intelligence is really important. For all types, but it's important for 3s to spend a little more time and energy on, right? And so each type has its own issues with the intelligence centers, right? And by attending to all three of these questions, I argue in the book that we become more wise. We cultivate wisdom.
Makes sense. Yeah. It's the integration of the missing center of intelligence, really, that produces the wisdom.
Right. I think so. And also curbs maybe our over enthusiasm for our dominant center,
right?
Which that adage, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think that can happen to each of the types in their own way.
And the practice triad?
Yes. So then the third territory that we get into is practice. And really, I'm referring to this as practice in time, in which I look at the way in which each type tends to look at time. And this is where I think there's a lot of work that we can do with our type to leverage it to be more discerning, wise, and healthy. Like the other territories before, I think there are three key questions for this triad. The first would be, what am I remembering? This is where we look to the past for guidance and help and information. The second being, what am I experiencing? This is the question of the present. Like, what am I experiencing right now, right here, right now? The third question would be, what am I anticipating? This would be the future, right? And so I find it interesting that we have this kind of triadic experience with time. And I think our Enneagram type tends to focus predominantly on one of those perspectives, supported by a second, and often we have a distorted or neglected relationship with the third. And so this is where the stances are also helpful. I think each stance has a stacking, and that is to our own detriment when we ignore the third. So if I could give an example, if that would be helpful. I've been picking on myself quite a bit.
Pick away.
Can I pick away as a 4? Okay.
Yeah.
So 4s in their withdrawing kind of posture towards life are prone to remove themselves from the present, and for 4s, that's for various reasons, right? To work through those deep emotional wells in order to kind of work through what does it mean to show up with significance and authenticity, because they have such a high bar for those things. And so what often happens is they have this kind of dominant orientation towards the past, right? Always looking back to maybe when things were more significant or meaningful, less mundane. And they can then vacillate from there to the future, where they have kind of this 4s have this perpetual idealism for the way things could be. But what that causes them to do is often be so frustrated by the present that they don't want to be fully in it, right? And so they tend to neglect or distort their experience in the present, which is why they withdraw. And so what I do in the book is I recommend that each of the stances really develop some practices related to that third neglected orientation to time. So for the 4s, it would be to cultivate what I call sacred presence. How do we learn to be here fully in the moment, even if it's mundane, even if you aren't quite sure if you are fully known, and all those things that 4s are always asking for and wondering. By cultivating some sacred presence, you actually create more opportunities for those things to be realized. Those things that the 4 truly wants to be realized.
And it's so sacred delay for the assertive stance, and sacred vision for the
vision. Yeah. So those assertive types struggle with the past. So sacred delay is really helpful, slowing down to look back. And for 1s, 2s, and 6s, they're kind of so mired in their present, condition that they struggle to kind of lift their gaze up and look ahead. So cultivating sacred vision is really important.
So brilliant and so helpful. And I really like, now that I remember it, the questions at the end of each type specific chapter. As you were talking about the 4 and cultivating presence, I'm reminded of the first question for the 4s hit me in the stomach. What was it again? Let me see. Do you mind that I read these?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so the questions for 4, is this thing I'm doing now the thing I really should be doing? That question makes me want to puke. It's necessary.
Busyness can be an avoidance strategy, right? Yeah.
I don't know. I can't speak for other 4s, but it's been difficult for me to notice my past preoccupation. That doesn't seem always immediately obvious. So I have to really watch for it. Personal curiosity. What was the most challenging idea in the book, Drew, to formulate or to write about?
There are plenty of challenging aspects to writing the book. I think generally speaking, writing a chapter on all 9 types, that took some stamina I wasn't anticipating. It would have been much easier if the Enneagram was a trineagram. It was just 3 types. But to do that 9 times was a challenge. Honestly, probably the stuff I approached with the most trepidation was chapter 4 on the time, the practice in time, because this is kind of my unique contribution to the Enneagram world, which is a scary thing and pretty audacious thing to do, right?
No, having read it, no, I don't think. I think it's a really great, important contribution. Well,
I appreciate that, but I did feel some trepidation. Hey, there are a lot of long-standing teachers who have created a lot of value in the Enneagram community, and should I really be adding this newish idea, to the mix, right? And will it be received? So I was very careful and cautious in how I approached that aspect of it. Yeah. But I just wanted to make sure that I honored the types as well throughout, because it can be really easy for types to feel slighted, by teachers. I wanted to be mindful that, each type truly is a mixed bag, and I don't want to have any sort of subtle judgments baked in that it would get in the way, of what I wanted to do with the book.
They're so careful and thoughtful, the type descriptions, actually. Yes. So Good job. Good job again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you
And
so
I
much.
know this would have been a sacrifice, I'm sure, not just for you, for your family. This is a lot of work. You know, completely worth it. The settling statements, I really love them. Was this you as well? This is new, right?
Mostly. Yeah. The settling statements, I've been looking for a way to distill the essence of the type without reducing it too much to just a stereotype or just a trait, which is a hard challenge. It's a hard thing to do with the typology that is really focused on internal motivations, right? And I had heard Suzanne Stabile provide what became the settling statement for the ones, and I attribute that to her in the book, that ones want goodness but settle for order. And I thought, oh, what would a similar structure be for each of the types?
Yeah.
And what I mean by settle, I don't mean like in a clinical psychological setting, there are settling kind of practices or grounding practices that are good and healthy. That's not what I'm referring to here. I'm really referring more to each of the types has this core desire or want. But what often happens, the personality convinces themselves that they can't fully have it. So they'll settle or compromise for something that's a little less than best. And that's what's going on in each of those statements. Yeah.
Yeah. I think they're really on the money. Can we read them or?
Yeah.
Sure. All right. Are you sure? Do you want to do it or shall I?
You know what? Why don't we alternate? How about that?
Okay. So I'm going to start with 8s. Type 8. 8 want protection, but settle for control.
Yeah. Do you want me to comment on that or just?
If you have a comment, I would love it.
Yeah. So I think 8s get mischaracterized. And I think what's best to understand about 8s is that they are immensely tender, but they're fiercely protective of themselves and those that they care about the most. And so they've just decided that the best defense is a good offense. They're not kind of the caricatured, power hungry control freak that everyone wants to think that they are, so often. So there's a lot more going on. Okay. So 9s. 9s want peace, but settle for control.
For calm, Drew.
Sorry. Thank you. I was still focused on 8s, I guess.
I know.
9s want peace, but settle for calm. Yes. Yeah. And I think that allergy to disruption, right? That disturbs the 9's equilibrium internally and externally causes them to, whatever calm can I just maintain in the midst of this, which then kind of thwarts their innate superpower and gifts being peacemakers, right?
Yeah, that one in particular is just perfect, I think. So 1s. Type 1s want goodness, but settle for order. We've spoken about that one a bit, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to know that 1s, they're kind of known to be maybe rigid or tough critics, right? They're toughest on themselves. And that's what's really driving the personality so often. Yeah. Okay. 2s. So 2s, they want unconditional love, or another way to look at this would be connection. If unconditional love carries some baggage, want connection, but settle for niceness. And so what they really want is connection. If they don't know if they can have it, they'll go get it, right? By being nice and sweet. And
so type 3s. Type 3s want worth, but settle for image.
Hey, I didn't come on here to be picked on, by the way. So. How dare you?
Can you say some more about that one?
Yeah. So I think what's really driving the 3 personality structure is that we really desperately want value and worth, but we question whether or not we are inherently value and worthy on our own. And so this is where 3s really struggle with being human beings. They're really good at being human doings, but being human beings is really hard. And so what we will do is we'll go manufacture value and worth by presenting a pleasing and impressive image wherever we go, and then getting stuff done along the way, which is why we're so adaptable and kind of shape-shifty and those sorts of things. Yeah. All right. So 4s, tell me what you think of this. It's kind of funny how this worked out.
I know.
4s want belonging, but settle for longing.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely provoked some thoughtfulness my end, and it has since I've read it. Yeah, so there's many ways that's true. What would you say more about it?
So I think what's really driving the 4 is that they want to be fully known and accepted, right? But in order to be fully known, that there's a high bar of significance, of authenticity, of realness, right, and intensity. And when that can't be met, they'll settle for to withdraw and just kind of long could be or what was, right?
Yeah.
And they have this kind of longing and melancholic kind of approach to life. And they kind of become very attached to the longing that they perpetually feel throughout. Would that be true? Would you say?
Yeah, it would. So the longing is serving a purpose.
One of my favorite quotes that I put in the book was from Leslie Hirschberger, who you've had on, right?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Who's describes fours as always experiencing the best of what's missing and the worst of what's present, right?
Yeah, that's so
that
good.
longing is always there. That idealism that is hard to reach. Yeah.
Moving quickly on.
All right, fives. I think it's your turn.
Right? Oh, is it? Okay. So fives want competency, but settle for knowledge.
Yeah. I think that competency bar again is so high that if they don't feel they can meet it, that's where they will also withdraw and just kind of pile up and acquire that knowledge, right? That they're so known for, which is also why they struggle to sometimes act in their world, because am I competent enough to act? There's always more I could learn. Yeah. Okay. Sixes. So sixes want loyalty, but settle for safety. And I think, sixes, they get a bad rap, get stereotyped as kind of the safety officers of the Enneagram or the fraidy cats, right?
Yep.
And I think what it is they are testing their environment all the time and testing it not so much for, am I safe here? I think that comes eventually, but more, I think what's at the core is, can I trust what's here, right? That trust and loyalty is so important and critical. They are looking for people and groups to align themselves with that they can trust and be loyal to. And that's which is why they're when they trust a group they're with, they're so loyal. Great team players, right? But until they get to that point, they're really skeptical and hesitant. And if that is in question, they'll just settle for securing their environment or being as safe as they possibly can, right? Yeah.
Makes sense. So last but not least, sevens. Sevens want contentment, but settle for excitement.
Yeah, I think we're always questioning whether or not we're content, right? And for the seven, that kicks in this hyper planning, mode. What can I have in my back pocket in case things get boring or difficult or painful? And then I can enact that plan and go do something exciting, right? And then that wanes, I'll enact the other plan, right?
Yeah.
Which is why sevens are so fun. But that's what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah.
Thank you for doing that with me.
Sure.
And I'm curious to know how the type specific books extend the framework. So what's happening in the type specific books?
Yeah. So, if you order the book, the Enneagram of Discernment, that, we're now referring to that as the complete edition. So it has everything that I've written on the topic thus far, right? What we found, which was great, but also interesting, a number of Enneagram teachers reached out and said, hey, I'm working with clients. I'd love to be able to give them your book. A lot of my clients are going to be intimidated by a 350-page book.
Yeah.
And so then what we decided to do, the publisher and I, to try out these type specific editions, which really, so if you have the complete edition, you have it all.
Okay,
but
great.
If you're looking for just information on the type 3, what it offers is all the stuff we talked about in the way of the discernment, which is part 1 of the book, all that's in there. But then part 2 of the book is a different chapter by type. So how the way of discernment looks for each type. And so it's just the type specific chapter for that edition. And then the conclusion. So it's still a substantial, it's like each one's 150 pages or so. So there's still a lot of content in there, but if all you're really focused on is, okay, what do I need to know about this particular type? That's an option for you. But if you have the complete edition, you have it all. But each one also has a different color on the cover corresponding kind of the traditional Enneagram color wheel as well. So
really?
If you want to collect them all, there you go.
That's great to have it accessible in the different format, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's all I, for now, wanted to ask you, Drew, except when's the new season of Fathoms?
Okay, so we're recording it now, and I imagine it will be launched by the time this episode releases.
Brilliant.
So it's been a little bit of work. Coordinating 3 co-host schedules is not easy, but I'm really excited about. I can give a preview. Okay, so we have a theme each season, and this season's theme is story. So how does the Enneagram help us live into a good and authentic story, which requires us unlearning some unhelpful stories, right?
Yeah.
And so we're looking at this concept of story through the lens of the Enneagram, and I love some of the stuff we're coming up with. So we're going to have some guests in the season that your listeners will know and love. And we're also we're going to try out some new things too. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, that's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. This was a joy. The time went quickly and it seems like there's more we could talk about. So we'll have to do this again. Okay.
Definitely. My next guest is the brilliant Jerry Wagner, or Dr. Jerome Wagner, who's going to be talking to me about MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, and the Enneagram. Definitely you'll want to hear that one. Do subscribe, rate, and all that jazz.